Since the beginning of this podcast, almost 100 episodes ago, I have been mining my 30-year Superman fandom, starting with that tattered red cape, within the larger context of the character's rich 85-year mythology, examining, discovering, and reconsidering the creative visions that have shaped the last son of Krypton. Now, our milestone 100th episode beckons, and the journey continues. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This is Electric Till 1 Million, Part 3. Joining me to discuss the legendary character Tempus from Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, is the host of Lois and Clark'd, the new podcast of Superman, and a first-time guest on the show, Matt Truex. Matt, welcome.
I am so glad to be here. Just the fact that you say legendary and Tempest in the same context means that I'm amongst friends, and that means a lot.
Absolutely. I have so been excited to do this. We've touched on Lois and Clark here and there over the life of this podcast. The last time we did one of these big Triangle era events, we did an episode looking at the infamous, notorious frog-eating clone arc. And we also talked a lot about the Lois and Clark relationship generally. So it wasn't all about the frog-eating clones, but we spent a lot of time on that.
Oh, gee, why? Is there a lot to discuss? I don't understand.
But I thought we have to check in with Lois and Clark one more time as we do this Triangle era event where we're covering 97 through 99. Obviously, Lois and Clark is in its final season during this period. But the character of Tempus, portrayed by Lane Davies, appeared over 5 episodes between seasons 2 and 4. And 3 of those appearances came in season 4. So I thought it would be cool to check in with Lois and Clark via this character and kind of get a snapshot of the series through the appearances of Tempus over the course of the show. So that's kind of how we landed on this.
I think that's really fair. I think Tempest becomes kind of emblematic of the types of swings the show will take. I don't think you get to Frog Eating Clones without Tempest going well and then the writers feeling emboldened and trying to recapture that as it goes on to various degrees.
I think that's fair. And as much as certainly Tempest is our focus, I really want to pick your brain because you very recently completed your Lois and Clark rewatch podcast.
Yes.
So first of all, congratulations on that because that's quite an achievement.
Well, thankfully for me, like there is an end in sight, like there's part of me that's like, thank God they didn't go 5 years. But what's more impressive to me is, our mutual friend, Zach Moore, who's got twice that and more going. And then you, although I imagine there's something kind of freeing in your podcast where like you could kind of call it quits at any time. Like this can be whatever you want it to be. Like, is that kind of where you are with it? Or is there a plan?
Well, there is a plan. I always have a plan, but you're right. I could do anything I want with this show, but I'm also, because Matt, there's no limit, I think, to the amount of Superman that I'm willing to talk about because I'm also
Anthony, tell me about it. Yeah.
I'm also early on in a George Reeves Adventures of Superman rewatch podcast.
Yes.
So that one, there is a commitment. Now, I could always say, all right, I'm only doing the black and white seasons, but I've committed. I'm going to do the whole series, but those are only 20 minutes each, but there are just over 100 of them. So, I just did episode 13, so it's like, we've got a way to go.
That's a whole other Lois and Clark, like in the middle of your, like, that's so impressive, dude.
It's so much fun and a different beast because there's no ongoing narrative. And even in the first season in particular, the episodes aired out of order. So it's they're really more these standalone pieces. And so it's not quite as daunting. But I'm so in awe of what you were able to do with Lois and Clark. And not that I'm asking you to like rehash your entire experience with it, but I'm
Please, let's sum it up.
But no, I mean, I'm just so curious what... I don't know, the big picture takeaways were or I don't know, put it more specifically, just your overall view of the show and what it meant to you and how it evolved. Like how is that different now than before you started that rewatch?
So it was my introduction ostensibly to Superman. Like I remember I was always a Batman fan. Like I'm a 1990 baby, so like I grew up where there was every flavor of Batman you could ever possibly want. Like I was born in it. Um, but then like Superman, I just saw as like he'd pop up in pictures of Batman from time to time, and my dad would be like, "Oh, they're friends." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, sure, Superman, fine." It wasn't until like I literally got a Burger King toy that was a part of their campaign for the animated series. And I got it on vacation, and it was like the only thing I had to play with, like that vacation. So I just asked my parents, like, what is the deal with Superman? And they kind of gave me the whole rundown. And when I got home, they're like, oh, you know what's on reruns that you might actually like is the Superman show, Lois and Clark, and there it goes. So it was my introduction to it. I loved it. I loved every second of it as a kid. As I got older and went to school for screenwriting and blah blah blah, I just like kept it was in the back of my head, and I'd rewatch it from time to time and be like, "What? Who made these decisions? Like how did this happen on a major network? Like it was just everything about it just seemed daffy and crazy and bold, but also like how did they get 4 seasons out of it? Like this is impressive." So when it came that the podcast bug bit me, I started with a co-host who had never seen the show before, and then he rightfully bowed out in early season 3 for personal reasons. But at the same time, I'm like, yeah, you're going through stuff. You don't need to be forced to watch this crazy Superman show. And then I kept on with it. But what it means to me now is this relic that I don't think we will see the like of again. It was a time where, arguably Superman was as popular and as unpopular as he's ever been all at the same time. Like there was no big movie, but also the death of, like comics were doing well. And it's all in the backdrop of the comics 90s boom and whatnot. But then they tried to adapt the show for an audience of not necessarily comic book fans. I think it was for kids and for at women mostly at the time, which was kind of an untapped comic book market. And I'm generalizing the hell out of this, so please like don't take that the wrong way, but it is a romance first and foremost. So coming away from it, I think it's incredibly cool as a relic of television. It's still my favorite Superman anything. And for me, it makes the Superman story. It's the reason for me that Superman story is a two-hander. It doesn't really get good for me until Lois is a key part of it, and for that, I'm very thankful.
Awesome. No, well said. No, it's very interesting to get your take on it, especially having just gone through all of it again. And well, it's funny when you mention your co-host. So I did a Patreon event with my wife last year where we watched the first season and then we talked about it, not episode by episode, but we did basically 4 podcast episodes
Sure.
covering the first season. And I think she enjoyed it well enough, but I've not been able to get her to do season 2 yet. So I'm still working on that. But I really, it's one of those things where I think our experiences are probably kind of similar in a sense where, I had a lot of fondness for it as a kid and a lot of nostalgia for it, but also as my tastes evolved and as I got older and I saw so much else, I kind of looked back on it, maybe kind of like yourself after going through, your screenwriting classes and looking back on it and being like, I don't know how well it would really hold up.
What the hell? Yeah.
Basically. And in rewatching that first season with my wife for the Patreon thing and in rewatching all the frog eating clone stuff that we talked about on this show, yes, there are definitely those instances where I ask those very questions. What were they thinking? Who signed off on this? Could they not have come up with something else? But at the same time, I'm so grateful that this kind of Superman story exists. And
Agreed.
Is it the sort of thing, if I could only have one Superman adaptation, is this the one that I would want? No. Well, obviously, my heart is always on with Smallville, as I talk about almost every episode. But I'm so glad that we have this for, like you said, the fact that we get this such a strong focus on the two of them. And I think that, and I've said this in a similar respect pertaining to Adventures of Superman, the George Reeves show, but the constraints, constraints make the artist. And so, yeah, they were limited in what they could do, but I think that forced them to focus more on the character. I mean, there's so much great interaction among all the characters, but especially the two of them. And I have said, and I will continue to say, I don't know that we've seen a Lois and Clark, actors playing Lois and Clark with better chemistry than that. We've seen others
Yeah.
come close, but not like this.
That was the interesting thing about doing the podcast. One of the interesting things was, I got to meet a lot of fans and have them on over the years. Christine Bartolucci and Lori Ann Collins jump to mind right now, where like they weren't comic book fans, but they were like totally enthralled by those actors' chemistry, and were like, and I was just like, so like, do you care about Superman anymore? It's like, no, it was about them. I would watch them play anyone as long as they had this chemistry. I'm like, I get it, like I totally understand it. So in that way, it was very, I think, approachable to a non, genre audience necessarily, and that's very interesting too. As these movies are now the height of pop culture, like we're having our moment. We're about to go the way of westerns in like another 5 or 6 years, but like as comic book nerds, we're having our moment. But they've kind of cracked the code in that way. But before this, it was nerdy and dumb, and like Superman, what do you like, Star Trek too, like all that kind of like all the bull that goes into that. But like that show made it kind of approachable, and that's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I was going to use my mom as an example, but she's actually also been watching Superman and Lois, and she watched some of the George Reeves show. So maybe not the best example, but what she watched the most of was Lois and Clark. Like she knows, and even when I was doing those episodes, or that episode on the frog eating clone stuff, boy, she remembered that. Not fondly, but she remembered that.
I've got my mother guesting on 2 episodes of the podcast, because she and I would watch it. It was in reruns on TNT in the mornings, and we'd tape it and watch like the first 5 minutes before school, and then watch it that night. And I have these great fond memories of it. And like she's like, "Yeah, it was kind of dumb. What was with the frog thing?" I'm like, "Oh, so we had different interactions than with the show. That's fine. That's fine."
Well, that you mentioned TNT, that was very critical for me as well with the show. So I was born in '87, so a few years on you. So I have some memories of watching it when it was first on, but again, I'm 6 to 10 when it's initially airing.
Right.
So I don't think I saw all the episodes, and I definitely don't have as vivid a memory. And I wouldn't have. I'm sure there's a lot that just went right over my head. But when they started airing on TNT, so this was now late elementary school for me. That's when I really
Okay.
watched this in earnest. And now I've been delving back into it more again for these podcast episodes, and it's really been such a treat. I guess one other big picture question before we get more into the tempest of it all is
Can't wait.
just in terms of the evolution of the show. I mean, I'm not breaking any new ground here in that there definitely was a shift after season 1 going into season 2, change in showrunner.
I didn't notice. No, really?
It was very subtle, very subtle, very
I
subtle.
should do the podcast again. All right.
But of course, we have the changing out of actors playing Jimmy Olsen. We lose Cat Grant. We lose John Shea as Lex Luthor. We get more of an emphasis on the Superman action, I would say, for better or worse. Your mileage on that may vary, but as far as the and then certainly even that aside, the relationship between the characters evolves so much over the course of the show, especially when she's in on The Secret. They're engaged, they're married. I mean, we really see that progression. So I'm just curious what your take is just generally on that evolution. And do you have a favorite era of the show or period in their relationship, maybe more
Totally.
specifically?
Yeah, totally. I kind of did this. I wrote this out for our mutual uh, friend Ed Gross's book coming out, the oral history that he's working on. And then I went through this in the final episode of Lois and Clark much more eloquently than I'm about to do. But for me, like season 1 is just the classic. Everyone's where they're supposed to be and acting the way they're supposed to be, and it's just got a bit of a bit more of a focus on the relationship, like the starting of a romance. The first act of a rom com, essentially. Season 2, they start getting a little bolder. They start the thing with the show is they couldn't do the big super feats all the time, but I think they chose their moments where they could and gave it their honest effort. And yes, sometimes it looks like community theater, but it's still cool that they try it. But they start that in season 2. Towards the end of season 2, we get Tempest, which I really do think is their first giant swing of like, how weird can we get? And then that's also kind of the end of the first era of the show where she doesn't know. And arguably the end of season 2, but really the first scene of season 3 starts with her knowing, and then kind of all bets are off, and it's a race to the altar for the next season or so. Um, while their world just gets, while the focus on the relationship gets more realistic and more nuanced, the outside world gets stranger and stranger, which is something I love about DC in general. Um, and I've got verisimilitude in my head right now from Richard Donner, but the idea of like, take the characters as seriously as possible, do not take their world that seriously, and that is totally what the show does, that I always really responded to. Season 4 they get married. Season 4 they admittedly run out of gas. Like it's not clicking anymore as much. There's some great nuggets in season 4, but the show really does peter out at the end, and kind of dies a deserved death at that point with a cliffhanger, unfortunately. But yeah, I think those are the eras for me. It's like goes from classic to when they really get into the relationship stuff, of her knowing, of them trying to figure it out. Like I always say, my favorite era of the show is like this 6 or 7 episode gap between her knowing and them trying to get married to frog eating clones, when it's just like they're essentially dating and trying to figure out this new dynamic. And I could have watched 8 seasons of that. Like that is so fascinating to me.
I will co-sign on that. I think that's the
Yeah.
sweet spot for the show. There's a lot that I enjoy before and a lot after, but I agree that for me too is definitely my favorite period, my favorite stretch in all of this for sure. And one thing that I guess one other big picture question, as far as the comics, and especially again this event that we're doing, we're looking at the Triangle era comics, and we're in the late '90s. Were you reading? Have you gone back and read? Are you familiar with this stuff?
I read Death of World Without and Return and all that. I haven't read much beyond that from this era. In fact, it's kind of a big question I had coming into this with you, not necessarily about this era, but kind of how it relates to the comics in general. But no, beyond the big milestone stuff and you're speeding bullets or whatever. No, I haven't read much from this era.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I bring it up because again, and I'm thinking about all of this as and just for context. So the stretch that we're reading now in the Triangle era, a reread for me because this is what I came up with back in the '90s. But this is the Electric Superman era.
Okay.
Which again, even if you haven't read, I'm sure you've
I know what
heard
this
of and
is.
seen
Yeah, to
it.
be clear.
And it's one of those things where, like you say, they as far as pulling in comic book elements and just the spectacle of it all. I would not have expected them to even attempt to touch something along the lines of Electric Superman. I can't even imagine how something like that would be realized on screen on that show
It would
at that
not
time.
have been good. Yeah, no.
But I will say that, and I've said this ad nauseum because I think it's the most relevant piece of the Triangle era for all of the big events and everything. I always come back to the supporting cast, and I really think that was what made that entire stretch of comics in the '90s work as well as it did. That's why the Death of Superman, which was how I got into comics, and Funeral for Fred, and all of that worked so well because you had built out this world of Metropolis and all the supporting players, starting with the core cast of the Daily Planet, but beyond that as well, Professor Hamilton, and of course we got the version of that with Dr. Klein and Bibbo.
Yeah.
So, and we got a version of Bibbo on. I remember that when I did my rewatch.
we got a Bibbo, yeah.
A Bibbo, but that's the thing. I think it really the Triangle era comics, I think, really gave you a good sense of the world of Metropolis, centered around the supporting cast, and I think that's where this show excels as well. That's where I feel I see the most kind of similarity, and of course hand in hand with that, the fact that in both instances, in the comics and the show, we're getting the first real meaningful, sustained exploration of the Lois and Clark relationship.
Yes, more or less coinciding with each other. Like that's very interesting to me. And in a reason why I say, like, yes, the comics were doing it at the same time, but I'm like, this show was kind of breaking new ground in that as it was going along. Certainly in multimedia, but in a sustained way along with the comics at that same time. Like that's really interesting to me. And something where like, yeah, I think a lot of Superman fans might scoff at the show, and to most extent I really do understand it, but there was something going on here that was adding to the fabric of what we now like, and that kind of can't be ignored.
No,
um
yeah,
can I ask you my big picture comic book question?
sure.
I've read I've read a smattering of like Silver Age Superman comics, but certainly not all of it. And whatever your whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrows and stuff like that too, your crises. But what when you watch this show, the feeling I get most from it is kind of Silver Age, that they're almost doing that in the middle of a soap opera. Like, is that fair to say? Like, do you ever get that vibe with just some of the stories, I guess, that they choose?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I guess my gut response is no, I haven't had that. I haven't gotten that particular vibe from it.
Mhm.
And in fairness, though, I mean, where I've spent most of my time over these past couple of years was in season one, which was more grounded. So I don't know. As I watch
Or
more of
yeah,
these,
yeah.
and even just in some of these Tempest episodes we're talking about, yeah, maybe. I don't know. There might be something to that theory. I wasn't thinking that specifically, but maybe.
These feel like the episodes where like he could blow out a sun or something, you know, like where that could happen. He has to fly up to the sun because resurrected Nazis irradiated him in one episode, and it's just like, well, this is the weirdest thing that's ever happened. You know, like this, some of this stuff must be kind of influenced by, and just thinking of the writers who were writing this at the time, who were 30, 40 something, they probably were reading those Silver Age comics already, you know, like maybe even just like leftovers or, you know, secondhand versions of it. But like that kind of era, it might be the Superman they're coming out with. So it's always been in the back of my head that like maybe this is responding more to that vibe than anything, or it's just its own version of this, and they're doing their best, you know.
Maybe, but no, that is an interesting question. One other follow up from what you were saying, because I really think this is an important point. I agree with you. This might be a show that a lot of hardcore fans or even casual fans kind of scoff at, but I think as Superman fans, we do owe a debt to Lois and Clark, especially on this front of the relationship, because
Hmm.
having recently spent a lot of time in the early 90s leading up to Lois finding out the secret in the comics and them getting engaged and eventually married, those comics broke a lot of new ground, but they walked so that Lois and Clark could run,
Yeah.
right? Because in terms of the depth of exploration that we could get in the relationship, and look, it's comics versus TV and the audiences that they're aimed at and all of that. So I think there's a lot that goes into why they were able to delve into as much as they could on the show. But that's one of the things. Reading those comics, I appreciated that we were at least getting as far as we were. But there were a lot of instances where it just felt like, and look, my perspective is different now as an adult married father. It's like I want more of the relationship stuff, and the
Yeah,
comics
yeah, yeah.
only kind of give you so much. There's a great
But
stretch
they've
where
got
they
a
break up.
Justice League to deal with or whatever, and like, yeah, I get it.
Exactly. Oh, there is a great stretch. We covered it last year when the Lois and Clark break up in the comics, and I thought that was actually some fertile ground that they were able to mine.
Mm.
But in any event, I think there's only so far that you kind of get, especially in those '90s comics. But again, I think that definitely helped, pave the way for something like Lois and Clark. And Lois and Clark really gave us some wonderful moments. And we mentioned the chemistry and just, Dean Cain and Terry Hatcher. Dean Cain is always the elephant in the room when we talk about Lois and Clark, and
Yeah.
it's something that we just sort of have to get past so that we
It's
can talk about this stuff.
addressed as often as it needs to be on my podcast, but yeah, he makes it tough now, but
It is tough,
not
but
not quite Smallville Chloe tough, but tough, you know.
I mean that's that's a whole other
We've all
category.
got our burdens, you know.
Yes, but just looking at the work, right, that he and Terry Hatcher put in, and I really was thinking about this, especially as I was watching those Tempest episodes, and this speaks
Mm.
to your earlier point about always treating the characters with integrity and authenticity, even as outlandish as the scenarios get, because watching the Soulmates episode where we're dealing with time travel via reincarnation and souls and all of that business. But I'm
Yeah.
watching it, I'm saying to myself, you know what? These two are still committed to this. They're
Hmm.
still in it and they're giving it everything. And I think to whatever extent it works, it's because of what they're bringing to it. So, yes, his real life politics, I wish he just kept to himself. But looking back on the work, I think a lot of it holds up. And that's why even some of these wacky episodes can work.
I totally agree. I think throughout, especially Terry Hatcher is the gift that comic fans still don't deserve. I think she's just like hands down perfect Lois Lane off the John Byrne page, in the Man of Steel days. Like that stuff I did read like right before I started doing the podcast. I'm like, oh, I get where all of this came from. Like Deborah Joy, the creator of the show, read this and went, I get this woman. Like of course that's what we can do. But yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I kind of said it earlier. It's the reason that I think Superman works best as a two-hander, where this show really positioned her as someone who's a part of what makes Superman Superman. There are many instances where Clark doesn't want to do this, or is willing to kind of give up the secret identity to just live out there or whatever, but like she understands that, like, no, that's going to cheapen what you do. That's going to affect you in this certain way. Like she's kind of the voice of reason that lets him be able to keep flying and keep doing what he has to do. And that's interesting to me. I've said this many times, but they are the ultimate first responder couple, where like no matter what is going on with their relationship, with their lives in any way, if he hears something and he's got to go, she's going to make that as easy for him to deal with as possible. And like that's a partnership, like that's really interesting. And while we all love Batman and stuff, like you don't really get that much with him. Sometimes with Catwoman or whatever, but like it's a totally different color that they get to play with the Superman stuff, and specifically on Lois and Clark. I think they do beautifully.
Agreed. Now,
yeah.
Here's our segue into the Tempest, because you were very recently on our mutual friend Zach's podcast, Always Hold On to Smallville, talking Requiem, the season 8 episode that gave us a version of Lex Luthor. If you want to put it that way. And I bring this up because Tempest is a new villain created for Lois and Clark in its second season, after the show had lost John Shea as a series regular, right? He would make an appearance in season 2, a few appearances in season 3, voice cameo.
He called in on season 4, yeah.
Which was more than Michael Rosenbaum did in the Requiem episode of Smallville. Which show handled the departure of Lex better, in your opinion?
Oh, God. I said this in the Requiem episode, where like on paper, if we explain what's going on with Lex for like those missing Rosenbaum years, I'm on board with it. And then in execution, I'm like, it's kind of stupid. I think probably Smallville, though, still anyway. I don't know. Lex gets so specific and kind of mired in his own mythos and story in Lois and Clark that they give you moments, but for the most part, it's kind of divorced from, the platonic ideal of Lex Luthor that we all have in our head, So in that way, I think Smallville keeps that alive, even though they kill him. And Lois and Clark, while he comes back and like they do the bald cap and whatever, like there are elements that they try to bring in there. He has some of his best scenes in the episode where he dies. It's just not quite the Lex Luthor I think of, though I love John Shea. I don't know. What's your thought on that?
You don't love the romantic Lex Luthor who just wants to be with Lois?
I love season 1 Lex, but then he becomes truly a villain in a soap opera of like, well, I will keep your love for my own, and we will retire to a ski chalet in different bodies, and like that. And that's just like, what is this? This is The Young and the Restless. This is something completely different.
It's very true. I love the impression. It's funny because I've been also checking out the Boy Meets World rewatch podcast, and one of the things I always talk about is, Bill Daniels, who played Feeney. All the kids thought he was British all along, and he's not. It's just that his diction is so precise that it's just like he sounded that way. But I think it's. And I know you guys have addressed this when you did that Requiem episode, and I know Zach's been talking about it. It's two different animals, because John Shea came back. He made those few appearances, and that made such a huge difference. I think what was so frustrating for us Smallville fans, especially in season 8, was they were teasing something that they never had a payoff for.
Yeah.
And it's, to this day, it's like, I don't know. Is it the sort of thing where it was Rosenbaum promising them he was going to come back and then he reneged? Was he not committing and they were just assuming and it's really all on them? I don't know. But it definitely felt like it was building to something that then didn't happen. And so I don't know. Like, I do have to give the edge to Lois and Clark because at least
Fair
Lex
enough.
remained a
I'll take
presence
it.
and he
Mhm.
popped up where you needed him to. And even just those, one or two, or even just the voice in the fourth season, it's like, okay, he's still there. He's in this world. And so I don't know. A tough situation on the Smallville side, but I think
Yeah.
let's give the edge to Lois and Clark.
I'll take it. Like, they're both they're both the reason I love TV so much, where it's just like, you can go into a season of television with whatever plan you want, but if that actor decides he doesn't want to come back, then you're going to have to pivot, and we'll see how you do it. Like, that is what happened with both of those shows. It's interesting.
But it's just that
Both of the
Smallville. Yeah, no, go ahead.
No, sorry. I was just going to say, it's a testament to the character in general and also those two actors that, like, whenever they did show back up again, they are the best part of that episode. Like, I'm John Shea's voicemail in season 4 is one of the best performances in season 4. Like, it's just what it is.
No, it's very true. I think where I see a distinction too, though, is Smallville pinned so much of season 8 on
Yeah.
Lex, right? And I think that just created these expectations. It's not. I don't think fans were like unreasonable, right? In what we were expecting. The show was leading us. It was leading us.
Imagine, like, they did the same thing in season 10 too. They didn't learn the damn lesson. It just happened to pay off, thankfully. But like, I remember the day that it was announced that he was not coming back in season 10, and we all went like, okay, well, I guess life is meaningless. And then, however many weeks or whatever later it came back, it's like, oh, thank God. Like, I was pretending to prepare to accept this finale without him, but I really wasn't ready to.
I'm right there with you. I remember seeing that TVLine.com headline that he's not. I was like, God damn it.
God.
And it was so.
And he's at every convention signing his Lex Luthor pictures. And you're just like, dude, come on, man.
And then
Anyway,
I remember not long after
it's a different podcast.
The other headline, yeah. But so kind of segueing into the Tempus of it all, right? So this is a time-traveling villain who appears over 5 episodes. Tempus Fugitive, season 2, episode 18. Tempus Anyone, season 3, episode 14. Soulmates, the 4th episode of season 4. And then a 2-parter, episodes 14 and 15 of season 4. Meet John Doe and Lois and Clarks, and portrayed by Lane Davies. For someone who hasn't watched Lois and Clark or hasn't watched in a really long time and needs a little bit of a refresher, how do you describe this villain, Tempus?
Tempus is phenomenal. I say this all the time. I love a villain who loves being a villain, and that is so what this guy is. He is from the future, the utopia that Lois and Clark's love created. Because of that, he is from this beautiful, peaceful time where he is incredibly bored as this violent sociopath, and has never had an outlet to express that until everyone's favorite or second favorite sci-fi author, H.G. Wells, shows up a day and brings him back in time and gives him an opportunity to undo this horrible, hellscape of a utopia that he lives in by killing Superman. He's so fun because he has all of the knowledge that he's not supposed to have as a villain, and he has absolutely nothing to lose. He has no cares about the status quo of anywhere he comes from. He's got no connections, personal connections to anybody. He just has this feeling of like, if I can get to a world where Superman doesn't exist, then I'm going to be all the better for it. And I can be my murderous, horrible, depraved, whatever self. And that is his only goal. And it's thrilling to watch with the right actor. And Lane Davies is certainly the right actor.
I know, well said. This is such a great addition to the mythos. I was doing some research on Tempus. I know there's a version of the character who appeared in Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen '98, but
What? Wait, for real?
Oh,
I've
I
always
thought you were messing with
no,
me.
no, I'm really not. I'm so sorry if that seemed sarcastic. No, I tell me about this.
I thought you were doing your best Tempest, and I was along for the ride. I was like,
Duh.
duh.
No, I always thought he was just a creation of the show. Please, God damn it. Of course,
I
this
don't.
happens when the podcast is done, but yeah, educate me.
No, my knowledge is incredibly superficial, and I've shared like 98% of what I've already know. It's just that there was this character Tempest, and I don't know. I think he was. I don't know if he was a full-on time traveler or like a fortune teller or something like that. But
Okay,
Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, number 98. But looking at the design, I mean, didn't look or behave anything
sure.
like this character. So, and I also don't know. I mean, I know to your point earlier about whether or not the writers of Lois and Clark were inspired by Silver Age comics. I mean, maybe I don't say this as a knock, but watching Lois and Clark, I never really got the sense of like, oh, these people are really into the comics.
And you're correct, sir.
So although I can say the same thing about Smallville as much as I love it,
Well, you might be correct, sir.
but with some exceptions. But I think that I assume this was kind of more of a coincidence than anything else. I think it probably just turned out that
Mm.
there was this so maybe
It
for
is a
future,
great time traveler's name,
yes,
but the minute we're done with this, I'm going to try to find a play. Like maybe DC Unlimited has it, but I'm
it
going to try to
doesn't.
find this issue.
It doesn't. You'll have to
Mm.
resort to other means. This is another recurring theme on this podcast where I often curse the that DC app as much as it has. There's so much
Uh-huh.
that's lacking. In any event, there is at least some sort of basis for the character in the comics. But again,
Okay.
I really don't think that was per se the inspiration here. But such a great character. I agree with everything you said. He's so sardonic. It's just that
Oh
grim
God. Yeah.
mockery, that scornful mockery, and the self awareness, right?
Mhm.
And to your point, he's a villain and he knows he's a villain and he relishes it. And it's just such a joy to watch. And he, in many instances, serves as the voice of the audience. I mean, we'll talk about it, but probably one of the most famous
That's
scenes
my
of the
big
entire
thing.
series
Yes.
where he's really giving it to Lois about her inability to, to put it together that Clark and Superman are one and the same. It's an iconic scene, and
Mhm.
I think in that moment, he really gave voice to people who were watching it who just could not get past this fact. So I think all of those things together, and then hand in hand with that, the fact that we're now in an era of the show where we've lost our main villain, but just as constraints make the artist, necessity is the mother of invention as well. And I think. And look, I think Smallville got there too eventually, right? Where you get into season 9 and all the Zod and Kandor stuff. I'm a big fan of that
Yeah,
season, and I feel like,
I
hey,
am too.
they finally dropped the Lex stuff and they just did their own thing, and it was good. And so similarly here, it's like this was a new addition, and again, in thinking about this episode in a way to sort of pull together a cross section of episodes and sort of represent the entire series. I mean, it's funny, and I want to get your take on this because on the one hand, these episodes are not representative of the typical Lois and Clark
Of the show
episode,
at large, absolutely true. Yes.
but in a lot of ways probably represent a lot of the best of the show and also the core. I feel like a lot of the core relationship pieces and dynamics, right?
Yes, absolutely. Because of the time travel angle. Because let's be very clear, Tempest means that H.G. Wells is about to show up if he hasn't already. Like once you see Tempest, like we're going to do time travel craziness, and our good friend H.G. Wells will show up to try to help us in some sort of way. But because of that, you have a little more story freedom to explore the characters at large, to explore the core of what the characters are. And because of that, you get to those moments that you're saying, the types that you don't usually get to say in the random episode. We're like, oh no, Clark's invisible or blind this up. What are we gonna do with a blind Superman? That's crazy. Like whatever, like that, whatever the plot of the week is type thing. These are mostly plot of the week episodes, but because of the time travel stuff and because of the knowledge he knows, they feel big, they feel like events, they feel like big stories, and they therefore get to highlight the cores of these characters that I think anyone listening to this podcast would agree with.
For sure. I have to say, one of the things that I was, because again, I'm working off of my memory from watching these as a kid, even
Mm.
the reruns in TNT, it's still going back decades at this point. I forgot how deep into season 2 the first Tempest appearance was.
Yep. This is truly like you say in introduction to in season 2, but like this is a late in the game, end of the year, let's try something episode. I've always wanted to talk to the two credited writers on this episode, and I can't really track them down, and they don't seem to have done much else writing wise besides this. But that first episode, 218, Tempus Fugitive, is probably, well, this might be blasphemous to say, you can make fun of me, but it might be my favorite Superman story of all time, because you get to do a lot of stuff. You get to tell Lois that he's Superman and explore that, and then you have a villain who knows how stupid all this stuff is, who just like cannot help but point out like how dumb all the contrivances of their lives as comic book characters are, and then the show wins every one of those things back by the end of the episode. And that's just like, that's magic to me, that one episode can tear it down and build it back up stronger in 40 minutes, you know.
Listen, I'm not going to knock that. Does it rise quite to that level for me? No, but
That's fair. That's fair. Sorry, I'm talking very grandiose about one episode of television from the 90s, but
no, but I definitely hold this up definitely as one of the strongest entries in Lois and Clark, and a very strong entry generally. And I could definitely see how, especially for someone, look, to devote your time to a Lois and Clark rewatch podcast, you have to love the show. Otherwise, it's a miserable enterprise, right? So for someone who loves the show, and for them this to be, not just a favorite episode, but your favorite story, I can appreciate that. And I think you're right. It taps into so much. And for me, of course, I always love anytime we're dealing with Smallville and the Kents. And so that's sort of the whole other piece of that episode where adult
absolutely.
Clark gets to interact with his younger parents. And there's so much emotion in those scenes. And again, I think this episode works on so many levels. Again, as not even silly, but look, I mean, we're dealing with time travel and a time machine. I mean, like you said, this is a big swing.
Hmm.
But amidst all of that, there's a lot from an emotional standpoint that I think really works well. Now, like you said, we meet H.G. Wells, and we've had two different actors playing H.G. Wells, which was another thing I had totally forgotten. When I got to the
Yes.
season 3 episode, Tempest, anyone,
Tempest, anyone? Yeah.
and we see an older and a different actor playing, I was like, wait, what? It took me, and then of course they address it that he's an older version. But I was so confused for a second because it's been a while. But we have, so Terry Kaiser, right, plays the younger H.G.
Hmm.
Wells in Tempest Fugitive and Soulmates. And then Hamilton Camp plays the older H.G. Wells primarily when we're dealing with the alt universe, which, we'll get to that. But that's sort of
Yes, that's
a
true.
whole other thing here where, to the show's credit, right? Like
Yes.
this is crazy to
Tempest
me.
gets us Earth too. That's the craziness. Yes.
That's the thing. And so for anyone who has not
God.
watched the show, or I mean, look, if
Anyone
you're listening,
has no idea what we're talking about at this point, but yes.
I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, presumably you've at least seen some Lois and Clark. But if you haven't seen it, or if you don't remember it, or you haven't seen these episodes, we deal with an alternate reality, and it's just so crazy to me because now we're in this era of the multiverse, and
Hmm.
the Arrowverse gave us a full-on adaptation of Crisis on Infinite Earths. Of course,
Yeah.
Marvel's going nuts over in the movies and TV shows with all of
They're
this goodness.
trying.
They're trying, yeah. But like Lois and Clark, and I know Superboy had dealt with that business on its show as
Right.
well. That still kind of remains a bit of a blind spot for me. I'm getting there, but
Oh my God, you too.
yeah,
Good. Okay. Yeah.
yeah,
Same.
yeah. All right. I think we're not aligned. I mean, there's so many levels. Even within the Superman fandom, there's so many levels to this because there's always some
And
other pocket of like, oh yeah, that's really a gap.
yeah. Well, you know what? The big one for me that's such a gap is I'm a huge musical fan. I'm literally sitting behind like a bust of Stephen Sondheim over here. I never really jumped into the musical. It's a Bird, It's a Plane, It's Superman. There's like one good song from it I like. I listened to it like halfway through one day, and I'm like, life's too short. I don't need to get into the, like that's one that's weird for me where I'm like, that's weird. That should be two great tastes that taste great together, but I don't think the show is any good.
I'll be honest. I've only ever seen snippets of it. I haven't fully
Yeah.
delved in either. But this always comes up because when I talk about the George Reeves show, look, in the context of the Christopher Reeve movies and everything that's followed, I think the Reeves show gets overlooked in a lot of instances. But that followed the radio show. And you talk about
Yes.
something that a lot of people really, have not delved into, myself included. The radio show is a great example. So again, there's so many levels to this, I
Yep.
guess.
And again, like, yeah, we're bad fans essentially. You're a better fan than me, but like, yeah, the radio show gave us so much of what is still active in Superman, and it's just kind of hard to pin down,
Yeah. But
to actually get into.
in any event, like, the Lois and Clark delved into parallel universes, right?
Yes.
Early in the game, far earlier than we would see later on. So it's just again, pretty remarkable. But in that first Tempus Fugitive episode that introduces
Yes, please.
H.G. Wells and Tempus, we do get, H.G. Wells explains this future utopia that
Yes.
the example of Superman and the relationship between Superman and Lois has brought forth. This was interesting to me because I was thinking about it, and especially in the comic book perspective, whenever we deal with the future of the DC universe, and I guess most specifically of the Legion of Superheroes, right?
Right.
There's this idea of what Superman has inspired, and that's a positive thing, but it's still a world where there's a lot of work to do.
Right. Where we
And
still need superheroes.
exactly. And of course, that makes sense because we need to sell comics and we're telling stories and there has
Right.
to be conflict and tension and all of that. But it was just interesting to me, this idea, again, in this more kind of isolated world of Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, that in the 22nd century, it's just this peaceful, harmonious utopia that, if I'm being perfectly honest, as Tempest was explaining it, I was saying to myself, I'm not totally on Tempest's side. I don't think you should resort to the
Okay,
methods.
I get this.
But at the same time, he's like, nobody works, nobody worries about anything. And it's just like, it sounds a little boring.
Yeah,
What is your
coming from a
take on this?
utopia, I don't. He has a line of like, I come from a utopia where I don't know how to use technology. I don't know how to use this machine, the time machine, but I can use this one, his gun. And I'm like, yeah, that's an issue. Like it reminds me, frankly, of H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, where the utopia in the future is not a utopia because you've got the Morlocks underground and blah blah blah, but it's also like this just seems like some flower child bullshit. Like this looks boring, like, so yeah, there is an argument to be made there. We never really get to explore the utopia side of things very much. So I don't have much stake in it besides just headcanon and my own fanboy thoughts. But yeah, it's an interesting thing, and I get it again why it might be a thing where comic book fans are kind of turned off by it because they're like, what are you talking about, utopia? The Legion of Superheroes are like, and I don't mean to use that voice, I'm sorry, I understand that, but I totally agree with you that for this world, that is the ultimate end game, that like if everything goes right, the love of these two people and what they do with it is going to save the world. Like it's pretty cool to me. I'm also a huge softie, which is also why I respond to the show so much.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think in broad strokes, I like it. And I've said this a lot of times on the show, and my perspective might change as we move forward. But I don't have anything against the concept of the Legion of Superheroes. It's the idea of a young Clark Kent, like, running around with them. That's very hard for me to reconcile.
Weird, right? Yeah.
But again, I will keep an open mind when I delve into that in the future. No pun intended. So, but the idea of their love having this impact in the future, that in and of itself, I'm fine with. And I don't, it's not like I have a huge issue with the idea that it's this utopia, but it was just interesting hearing Tempest talk about it. And I guess maybe this is part of what makes him a compelling villain, where you do, at least to an extent, get his perspective, where again, like, I'm listening to this and it's like, yeah, all right. I mean, maybe it is kind of boring.
5,000 channels and nothing on. Yeah.
Yeah. What's your take on, because you've spent so much more time with these episodes and this character. In
Such a
terms
weird
of,
thing to be an expert on, but keep going.
listen, everybody has their thing, man. It's all good.
I found my niche. Yeah. What's up?
But I mean, and it's very specific. I mean, how many people can say this? So there's something for that. But I mean, in terms of sort of when Tempest hatches his plan and what his, or I guess when these this plan forms, when he initially gets in the time, when we don't see this, but in the future, when he gets in the time machine with H.G. Wells, do you think at that point he's like, he's looking for something to change, or is it because the way it plays, it's like you see him
See.
walking through the streets of Metropolis and it seems to awaken something. And I was having a hard time sort of drawing a line between what he kind of came in intending to do versus what he saw that really triggered him, so to
Mm.
speak.
I think it's one of those kind of love at first sights where like he's supposed to be walking when we first see him, he has just come from the future into 1995 and is walking down the seedier streets of Metropolis by the porn theaters and the that type of thing. And I it's love at first sight. I think he's just like instantly like, this is out there, like this is what life could be. It's that small town kid goes to the big city and finds out what they've been missing, and it's totally that in a horrible, murderous, like, terrible way. But he just realizes then, for me, like, oh, I'm a violent person. And in some, in the past, in some worlds, that's okay, like I can find an outlet for that. And it's also interesting to me that his ultimate first evil plan is to do, like, kind of, what's the thought experiment of, like, well, what would happen if you used a time machine and went back and killed Hitler as a baby? And it's just the exact reverse of that, but it's still that same kind of simple thinking of, like, he's not this grand mastermind. His plan in season 4 is much better than it is here, but here he's just going on instinct, going like, what's my problem? Superman. What could I do with the time machine? Okay, let's figure this out.
Yeah, go back in time and kill him as a baby.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it's no small feat, right, to introduce a villain that wins the audience over. I think as effectively as Tempus did. I mean, not that I have my finger on the pulse of the Lois and Clark fan, but I mean, it seems like this is a character who is well
Beloved.
received and well regarded. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so to do that and to do it so quickly, I mean, even just watching that scene where he stumbles upon someone getting mugged and then proceeds to mug the guy further and
Mm-hmm.
just takes such delight in the fact that I'm mugging you. And it's just like, it's
Just mugged you.
like, that's the thing. It's such a great balance with this character. And I know I'm not, you've talked about this. I'm not saying anything you haven't already
No,
thought
please.
or said or heard, but just this, this balance between this, he's so sinister, but so funny and self-aware. And it's just like a
Mm-hmm.
very potent mix that's fun to watch, but also not a joke. I think that's the thing, right? That they
Yes.
still feels like stakes, but it's also funny.
Yes. It's one of my favorite movie villains of all time is still Jeffrey Rush as Captain Barbossa in that first Pirates movie. And it's kind of the same thing for me too, where like you feel a little bit for Barbossa and what he's been through, but at the same time he's a bastard and he should die at the end of the movie, but you're gonna feel a little bit bad about it. And Tempest is that for me, where it's just like you were saying, like you do kind of get where Tempest is coming from, and that's interesting. And he's doing these horrible things, but God, he's having such a great time doing it.
Yeah. And so,
Yeah.
we get into the time travel aspect. And of course, H.G. Wells is able to, manipulate the time machine and send them to 1866 Smallville instead of
Mm-hmm.
1966 to buy Lois and Clark some time and all of that. But, and, again, you've done the full on, episodic rewatch of this. So we don't have to go beat by beat here. We can talk more broad strokes and big moments of all of this. Because I want to get to this scene in 1866 before H.G. Wells and Tempest go to 1966 and they're in the
Mm-hmm.
barn with Lois. And we get this big moment where Tempest reveals to her, and it's tough to watch, right? As fans of Lois, we love the character, but yeah, there is also this huge piece of how are you not recognizing that Clark and Superman are one and the same? And it's this iconic, famous bit of him putting on the glasses and taking them off, and I'm Clark Kent, I'm Superman. Do you want to do some of the other dialogue? Because it's such a classic.
The thing I love is that he really cues her up for it too, where he's just like, where I come from, you're one of the most revered women in history. You're a breakfast cereal. But the question that keeps coming up is, how dumb was she? And that goes to the thing I was talking about earlier, where like the beauty of Tempest is he is built having this kind of almost meta knowledge of this universe that he's been plopped into. just by virtue of being from the future, he can call out the stupid parts of Superman, which I love. I love Superman. I love Superman. Glasses, no glasses is a really dumb disguise, and anyone that loves Superman and can't admit that is not looking inside themselves enough, and that's what he does here, and it's incredible. But again, kind of going to that thing where I was saying, like, the episode kind of buys it all back, is he gets to make fun of that, and they get to make hay about it, and they get to do this whole episode about it, and then ultimately HG Wells gets to explain, like, no, like, you're not stupid, you're blinded by love, and that's why it works, that's why we care, and that's why your story means something, and that's awesome to me. And still you get to have this cruel moment that sets up the rest of the episode.
I'm with you that, it's funny because I guess a lot of us remember that the scene in the barn and he calls her galactically stupid and
Mm-hmm.
the duh, right? And all of that. But I agree that that moment with H.G. Wells, I think, reconciles a lot within the context of the show and the larger mythology. And I'm with you. We've talked about this a lot, and even off the show, like whenever this comes up with the whole idea of the secret identity, I will forever defend that the average person on the street wouldn't recognize Clark for the reasons that, we're often given specific reasons, right? He changes his posture and his voice is a little higher. Of course, in the context of Lois and Clark, there's little to no differentiation other than
Dean
slicking back
Cain
the hair.
was very pretty. He was a limited actor.
So, that aspect of it is not really a play here. But I can always chalk it up to the fact that why would someone be looking for Superman on the street,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
Mm-hmm.
that I never really bumped up against that. But anyone, and Perry and Jimmy could probably fall into this category, but Lois more than anyone else, anyone who is having one-on-one, face-to-face contact, and in the case of Lois, intimate moments with both people,
With
it
both of them.
is beyond ridiculous that she wouldn't recognize them. And, sort of the flip side of all this, which the episode gets into, which I really love, is, how could Clark, perpetrate this ruse against
Mm-hmm.
her? Because there are a lot of instances where you can chalk it up to, well, it's just a desire for privacy, and he's, showing one side to the world and keeping another back, and we all do that in various forms. But in the case of Lois, I mean, and I know they address this in the episode, where it's like, I didn't lie. Like, I just told you certain facts to keep you from learning other
Right.
facts. It's like,
A certain point
okay.
of views her. Yeah.
That whole business. But that's the thing that's always tough as a Superman fan, her inability to recognize and his lies to protect this side of him. That's why I really do prefer the Smallville take, the Man of Steel take, where Lois is just in on it from the beginning, because we avoid this from both sides. Or even something like Superman and Lois, where when you get the flashbacks in that show, you get more of a sense that she was primarily interacting with Clark. You didn't have so much of this
Right.
triangle business. But I'm with you. Like, I was so taken by that H.G. Wells speech, because it's like, yeah, no, there is this sort of this other reason for it, this blinded by love. And I think there's a lot that we can kind of chalk up to that. And I really
Yeah.
appreciated that.
I think that goes to kind of Clark's point of view in the episode too, where, like, it's not said, but for me, it's like he can do anything as Superman, but he doesn't really want to. And he could get Lois Lane as Superman, but it really wouldn't be the same thing if he's playing this persona when Clark can't have her. And that's really sweet to me. Like, that's very interesting and buys a lot of the kind of lies stuff. Again, in this episode, because we get to talk about these kind of basic tenets of these characters by virtue of the story that they're telling, we get the line where, like, she is pissed, she is upset, and, like, when the first scene with Clark, afterwards, and she's like, like, he's like, don't you know that it was hard for me to watch you pine after Superman and not notice me? And she's like, well, what are you talking about? You are Superman. No, Superman is what I can do. Clark is who I am. And however stupid you think this show is, like, they got to the core of it. And, like, that's it in a nutshell. And that's so interesting to me, like, that idea that he kind of justifies this lying because he's playing a part as Superman. Like he is the guy, and it's the opposite with Batman that we always say, right? Like Bruce Wayne's the mask and he's the, it's, I don't know. I kind of got lost in my train of thought just thinking of that wonderful scene, but that's very core to this whole dynamic between them and what they get to play out in this episode.
No, absolutely. That was definitely a standout scene for me as well. And it's something that, prior to doing this podcast, I don't know that I would have articulated this necessarily, but now what I've become keenly aware of is that between growing up with the Triangle era comics and with Lois and Clark, what's encapsulated in that line, right? Superman is what I can do. Clark is who I am. That is hardwired into me and how I see the character.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I can love and appreciate the Christopher Reeve performance. It's amazing. It's iconic. I get why everyone loves it. I get why everyone loves the movie. I get it.
Yeah, yes.
But it's always the thing that I bump up against, in particular, the depiction of Clark Kent as this bumbling caricature. And within this context, this God living among men and needing to masquerade, I get it. But it's just not the way I see the character. I see the character as Clark. And so that's why, and I'm really, that's the thing, like so many things are clicking into place for me. I think I see why I love the George Reeves show so much, because you talk about a competent, capable Clark. It's very, it's very, and look,
again,
of course,
Superman is a skill in that show,
yes.
like 100%. He's a skill and a public figure, which is essentially what he is in Lois and Clark too.
And of course, Lois and Clark, the new Adventures of Superman. So, kind of in that vein, and it's very similarly in the George Reeves show. It's like in terms of the performance, a very little differentiation in terms of what he's doing as Clark versus as Superman. But
yeah, Dean Cain wasn't a bad actor. He was just homaging Christopher Reeves or George Reeves, excuse me. Yeah, that's all it was.
So, but
no, I couldn't agree more. It's the same reason why, like in modern stuff or whatever, I kind of hate when people call him Cal. When Justice League, when Wonder Woman or something calls him Cal, and I'm like, I don't think my again, platonic headcanon ideal of Superman would want to be called anything other than Clark by his friends. I don't get where he kind of identifies with Cal the same way I don't think he identifies as much with the persona of Superman.
I agree. Because if it's really just Wonder Woman, I could just buy that's their thing, and that's
like
how she sees
Kara.
Yeah.
Kara, whatever, however you want to say it. I just realized that the CW has completely indoctrinated me into Kara, but like that I get. She knew him on a planet where that was his one and only name. Like that I totally understand. But I don't know. If Bruce ever called him Cal, I'd be like, bullshit. That's Clark to him.
Agreed. So no, I mean that scene was wonderful, but going back to the pronunciation, yeah, the Kara thing is something I will never get past. It's always Kara to even before Smallville. It was always Kara to me. Also, in the alternate universe episode that we'll get to in a second, we get our one and only
Lana
Lang. And again, another instance where it's like it's Lana. Come on. Yeah. It's very it's very tough.
Is it Lana in the animated series or is it Lana?
Oh, it might, and I feel like it hasn't been that long since I watched it, but I think they did hit on Lana there, I think.
Yeah.
I'd have to double check.
Yeah, okay. Well, good point. I guess there are flaws with Lois and Clark. I take it all back.
Look, one or two, it's not a big deal.
Yeah,
otherwise,
exactly.
it's
here and there.
Perfect. It's basically perfect. But no, that scene with them by the car is tremendous. And then with them in the car, and especially as we get deeper into the episode, and I don't want to gloss over the scene with the Kents, we could circle back to that, but after they're leaving the Kents, and his hand is starting to disappear because
Tempus, back his future away.
Yeah, Tempus is placing the kryptonite around baby Kal-El, and the Clark now is starting to fade away. But I think especially after that scene with the Kents, Lois is starting to gain some understanding here and is recognizing how lonely this must have been for him to not be able to share. But what I loved was, again, we can never underestimate the value and the importance and the role of the Kents in this story. And as he's quick to say, he's like, I wasn't alone. I quote this a lot, and I get chills every time I say this, but the Grant Morrison Batman run, there's this great line at the end of it where he's like, the secret, the first truth of the Batman, the saving grace, is I was never alone, right? And this whole idea of the Bat family and Alfred and all this. And the same thing with Superman. It's like, no, Mont Pa were there. And he even says to Lois, it's like, even you were there too. Even if I couldn't share everything the way
Right.
I wanted to, it's like you were there. So that was such an important point, and I really love that. And again, getting that scene of him seeing his parents, it's like I think about that. It's like what a weird experience that would be to see it with your parents or grandparents, like to see them as contemporary. Well, I mean, they were still older, but to see them younger.
as 50-year-old actors with eye pulls going on. Yes, but
But it was so, like, you saw how meaningful that was to him, and also just to kind of, because that's the thing. And we did multiple episodes on the various tellings of the origins over the years, and with Lois and Clark, obviously, when you start this series, he's already an adult, and yes, you see the Kents help him make the costume and all that, but you don't get the ship landing and them finding him and all that. So like, this was so, just from the Superman mythology standpoint, like, it was so cool to see the young Kents pining for a child.
This episode is why I was obsessed with the spaceship from that series.
Oh my God.
A listener printed this out for me from a 3D model I had made, but it just like the iconography in this episode is incredible for what you're saying. Like, we never did get to see those moments. We never got to see. It's all a tease with the Lois stuff, but we never got to see them interact like truthfully before too, and they get to do it here.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, that's the thing. I think overall the highlight, right? Getting to see Lois's reaction to knowing the secret and having them talk it out. Like I said, crazy to me that we're just a few episodes away from her knowing fully.
Actually doing it, yeah. But even still, again, we should get into this just real quick. The end of this season, they shot 3 different versions of the final line, and it was, he's proposing to her, and she kind of stops him. And the one that they aired was her just going, "Clark, to be continued." The one that they retconned at the beginning of season 3 with is, he's proposing to her, who's asking, Clark or Superman? And she whips off the glasses. And it's just like, they didn't even kind of have the guts to go with that at the end of season 2. And that drives me nuts, because it's like, that's your perfect cliffhanger, and yet didn't do it, but yes, but story-wise, there are elements at the end of season 2, which is how she kind of pieced it together.
Yes. And that's one of the other things that, I will forever champion Lois and Clark for having her figure this out. That's one of the things in the comics. He proposes and doesn't tell her. Rip. And then we get the shirt rip later. And then they, later on, she's like, "Oh, I kind of always suspected." It's like, yeah, but that really, we were not shown that. And so I feel like you have to give that to Lois. And I think that's the sort of what else this Tempest episode adds, where you get to see an instance where she doesn't figure it out. He doesn't tell her, right?
She finds out in the worst possible way, really.
Worst way. Yeah. Time travel escapade with this madman, right? Telling her in the most belittling, harshest way.
You're an idiot. Yeah.
Galactically stupid, which gets said 3 times in the episode. So yeah, no, there's a lot. It's amazing. And then we get to see, sort of, Clark's, or the way the Kents had always told Clark the story, right? They were driving past Schuster's Field, and they saw, like a shooting star and all that. And it was at night. So he's confused because the ship has already landed during the day. And then, of course, he realizes he has to be that shooting star that will lead them to the ship. And he's standing there, right, as he's watching them, pick up the baby. Now, this doesn't go as far as Smallville did in episode 150, Apocalypse.
where he puts himself in the ship. Yes.
But I guess, what is your take generally on these instances of Superman inserting himself into his own origin story via time travel?
I don't know. Like, holistically, it's probably stupid. For this show, I think it's lovely. Let's be very clear. The time travel in these episodes, makes 0 sense. And I say that as now the co-host of a Legends of Tomorrow podcast. But like, it makes Legend of Tomorrow look like, very mapped out and scientific. But it doesn't really matter to me. The spirit of that, I wish there was kind of that moment of like, oh, it's got to be me, maybe they wouldn't have pulled that off as well, but I think it's lovely, the effect that they have of just the blur going overhead in the sky, and that stopping the Kents and him leading them to him, I think is beautiful.
I think Lois and Clark, I think lovely is a great word. I think Lois and Clark struck a nice balance where he's there and he can see that moment. I think Smallville, I love it forever, but I think that went too far by actually having.
But that was a
either one.
retcon situation too. Like, it's not like we saw Jor-El and Lara put him in the ship in season 1 of Lois and Clark. We never saw that discovery, like you're saying. So like, there's nothing that we're treading on here, you know?
Yeah. So as we move forward kind of through these Tempus appearances, he reappears a little past the midway point in season 3 with this Tempus Anyone episode where he shows up and plops Lois onto the time machine again. But this time, instead of traveling through time, we go to an alternate universe where Clark has never become Superman and Tempus is running for mayor. Side note, I don't mean to go on a tangent here, but I got to bring this up because
we're on a podcast. We can't go on a tangent.
Yeah. So I mention this, like almost every episode of the George Reeves rewatch podcast, whenever we talk about Perry White, because there's this bit in one of the final episodes of season 1 where via narration, they tell us that Perry White in the Adventures of Superman universe used to be the mayor of Metropolis. And the only time to my knowledge that this is even mentioned in that entire series is in that narration. And I've been saying, I'm like, I can't think of any other instance where there's been anything to do with Perry White and mayor, but in this alternate universe, right, he's running for mayor. It's, so that's
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
that's really cool. I'm sure not remotely on anyone's mind in the writer's room during this, but that's interesting.
Yeah. So as I was watching this, I was like, God damn. And also, no, I guess there might not be as much overlap between viewers of the two shows, because I've been mentioning this a lot on the other podcast of like, there's never anything else to do with Perry as mayor. No one has reached out to be like,
no one has been like, hey, by the way. Owner of the Daily Planet, Jimmy Olsen, was helping him run for mayor in Earth 2 on Lois and Clark.
Yeah,
Mr. Olsen, excuse me. Yeah, sorry,
Mr. Olsen. And like we said, this episode gives us the show's one and only appearance of Lana Lang. Of course, before Lois goes to the alt universe,
who sucks.
She's so bad.
It's such a bummer to me. As a fan of as someone whose first real true crush during important changes in my life was Kristen Kreuk as Lana Lang. Like, she gets so shortchanged in this, and it's very unlikable. She's so bad that he doesn't become Superman. Yeah. That's tough. And there's a little bit of a lack of Kents for him in this too, but yeah, no, that does happen here. They're okay. Friend of the show, co-host of All Star Superfan, pointed this out to me. Really, Rob O'Connor. There's also the Elvis thing in this world, where I believe Elvis is president, if I recall correctly, in Earth 2.
Or had been president, something to that effect.
Yes. Elvis, of course, in real life, who was very much a Superman fan, more a Shazam, Captain Marvel fan, but like literally wore capes in concert because of Captain Marvel. And the aesthetics put forth in comics by Superman. So there's the whole snake eating its tail craziness of this too, where there's an Elvis in this world who's in a jumpsuit, like we see him from behind or whatever, but also in a world where Superman doesn't exist. So it's just like, what inspired him here? This is insanity.
I hadn't thought about that, but that is actually a really good point.
but I brought the podcast to a screeching halt, but it's fun, right? Yeah, it's interesting. Anyway, no, I love this episode. To get back to our main man, Tempus here, because I like the idea that he's like, all right, killing Superman didn't work for me. So what if I can just find a world where I can stop Superman from ever even happening? And I kind of read between the lines in this episode and think that's what happened, where Clark lost the Kents very early on in this episode. I forget if he says why, but like maybe a car crash or something. Car crash. And also Lois goes missing on a story right before she, should have met him. And to me, that's Tempest. Like both of those instances are him going like, apparently I can't kill Superman. That didn't work out, but let me try a different tact. What if I took away his support system? What if I took away the three people that would result in him being some sort of force for good in the world? And it works. Like it works completely. And he's on his way to amassing some sort of political power and taking over. And, he's already got a kind of a I don't know, like it's like a store basically. He's got like Tempest and such or whatever in Metropolis. Like he has power already, and it's literally our Lois coming to that world that is what thwarts him. That's very interesting to me.
I very much like that theory. I'm ashamed to say that I was even thinking that, but that's a great take, and I think that's a great way to look at it.
100% between the lines, but headcanon, that's what it is for me.
No, I like that a lot. And yeah, he set himself up. He's selling guns and sunglasses, I believe.
That's it. Yeah.
Which is a great callback to Tempus Fugitive.
Two of his
right?
favorite things.
Yeah, exactly. So that works out nicely. The thing about it that's kind of fascinating to me is everything that you said totally tracks, right? That he goes to a world without Superman, or potentially even creates a world without Superman
right.
by
taking
out the people who make him that.
Let's narratively give it that, where like he found the world where the Kents die early, and he's like, perfect.
Right. Yet, his plan in this episode, he brings and that was actually, to the show's credit, I'm watching it and I'm saying, why? What is the plan here? And again, I don't remember this from watching it as a kid. I'm like, why would he bring her here? And then you get the payoff that he wants her to help create Superman to be this enemy that he's been warning the city against. And then he can defeat this enemy in front of everyone and become the mayor and amass all of the power that he seeks. It's sort of like, bro, you should have quit while you were ahead, sort of thing.
It's that Riddler victory lap thing of like, you're too stupid to actually, figure this out. Yeah. No, 100%. But yes, I do love that as a conceit where like, as his victory lap, essentially, he's going to take Lois, make her create a Superman, and then he's going to thwart him instantly. And that's like the ultimate revenge he can put on Superman, and specifically this Lois who screwed him up last time.
Yeah. And, just the hubris of trying to do this, right? And it is ultimately his undoing. So, again, I think it certainly tracks in the context of this. And like I said, to the show's credit, I'm watching it. I was genuinely curious. I was like, where are we going with this? And then, of course, it all fell into place. Though, the fact that the Kents weren't there, that they died in this car crash when he was 10, of course, I'm very sad for this version of Clark, but for narrative purposes, I appreciated it because it would have rubbed me the wrong way if it's like he's just not Superman because Lois isn't there, right?
Because Lana sucks, yeah.
Yeah, because he's with Lana and not with Lois. And it's like, Lois is crucial. She's a key component of the story, but especially with the decision to become Superman, again, at least the way I see it and the way it plays out in the origin story, it's like there's so much that comes before that. So that helped me reconcile a lot of this. The fact that it's like, no, he doesn't have the influence of his parents, and he has the wet blanket that is this Lana Lang.
Yes. Who also, like, we're giving her hell, but like, I understand her wanting to keep her fiance safe and like stop, like that type of thing. But it really isn't played like that. It's also like, to what you're saying about the Kents, canonically, think of how many times in season 1 he flew back to Smallville to talk about the problem of the week, and without that as a sounding board, as he says in Tempus Fugitive, like, I had them, this wouldn't have happened. Like that's really key. Like, this version of him had them for a second, to the point where he's heartbroken, where when he finds out that our Clark still has them, there is no ounce of bitterness or jealousy in his voice. He's just like, that's really nice. Like, the good for him. He sees them a lot. That's amazing. Like, he's still Clark, like, he's just so happy for this other version of himself that gets to have these beautiful people in his life still. And without them, and without that constant do-gooding, I say, respectfully, voice in his ear, maybe he doesn't quite get there.
Exactly. No, I love that too. I love the way that was played. Like you said, that question of, does he see them a lot? To spend a lot of time with them.
Yeah.
It really hits you. And then, when we get to the final two-parter that we'll touch on in a minute, where H.G. Wells brings the alt universe Clark to our world,
Oh,
and our Clark is lost in eternity, aka the Phantom Zone, which is,
the
they did a version of the Phantom Zone,
kind of the
kind
Phantom
of.
Zone, kind of the quantum realm. It's all, yeah, exactly.
But to see his reaction to seeing them, right, and their reaction when he reveals that he lost his version of them, it really, it gets you. And that's the thing, like we've been saying, just that, grounding it in the character and the emotions, it goes such a long way and really pulls
Hmm.
you in, as zany as the episodes might get.
Again, do not take the worlds that seriously. Let there be Earth 2s or whatever. But when you put an orphaned Clark in the room with the Kents, take that very seriously, and that's the key.
On the Lana of it all, Emily Proctor, who went on to star on CSI Miami,
Hmm.
and this was not a fault of her. This was not, again, in terms of the writing, I think that they could have done a lot more. I agree with you. It's not, she's not totally one note. There is definitely, she does articulate this idea of,
Right.
hey,
She's not Regina George. Like, she's not this horrible, horrible person. She's just not a great influence on him.
right. And she does articulate, like, hey, if you do this, like they'll send you to a lab, they'll dissect
Hmm.
you. So there is some genuine fear there, but she just
Bit
comes
of a
off as,
John Snyder, type Jonathan Kent reaction. Absolutely.
yeah, I mean, there's definitely that flavor, but I think she just comes off as just kind of shrill and overbearing, and there could have been a little bit more nuance or relatability or sympathy, for this character.
Mm.
I'll also say, and I don't, again, I'm sure you've talked about this, but just the overall lack of Lana on the show. Like, I always thought watching the green glow of home, it's like, man, if there was ever a
Yes, I was
time to
just
like
gonna say.
to like use Lana, it was crazy to me.
Yep, and they have that kind of sheriff or deputy or whatever character in that clearly used to date or have a thing for Clark, and they just don't go. Yeah, but again, as you were saying, maybe not everyone on the writing staff has cracked a comic book.
Yeah, and look, in fairness, at least they used her here, right? There was an opportunity. It's like,
Totally.
okay, a world without Lois, and we had Lana.
By then, I think there was a bit more of a nerd influence on the writers' room.
Side note, as someone who has now been married for 6 years, the opening of the episode in our world where Lois and Clark are talking about the wedding, the
Wedding
wedding
planning
planning,
and
and he's
stuff,
like, "Oh,
yeah.
I ran into Lana, and she wants to come to the wedding." And Lois is like, "What did she say when you told her no?" He's like, "Well, I didn't tell her no. Like, she just kind of assumed she should come." Again, as someone who's gone through this process, yeah, buddy, you really dropped the ball there. That's not that's not really a thing. I was with Lois on that one.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I might have a weird perspective on this. Like, my ex is totally coming to the wedding, but
It's, what it is. I know I'm not even talking about it in context of the X. It's the timing. That was what got me.
Mm.
It's like I think it was it was like the day before or days, but like that was more. It was
Yeah,
the
because it's the episode before Clone Frog
yes,
stuff, I think.
yeah. It is
Right?
literally the
Yeah.
episode before.
So we're like 1 or 2 story weeks away from the wedding. So you're absolutely right. We can't squeeze her into a table at this point.
Exactly. That was
Yeah.
that was what it was for me. But yeah, I mean, overall, cool episode. I thought, to just delve into this idea of this alternate reality. The Perry White as mayor thing was cool, just as a fun little connection point, and to see Lois help create Superman, right? And
Hmm.
she makes him the costume, and I do like, though, that we got to see that he was still using his powers to help people. It was kind of sparingly, and it was in secret, and it was while avoiding Lana, but he was still
Right.
doing it, right? There's this gunfight that he intervenes in secretly. So that core is still there, but she brings out the superhero in him, and it
It
was cool to see that.
it does make me wonder, and I guess it's I guess we can just chalk this up to the Kent's influence over the years, like slowly somehow putting this in his head. But he is the one in the pilot to come up with the idea of, like, well, what if I wore a disguise? And he just kind of hasn't gotten there here, to the point where, like, it's very clear he hasn't, like, thought about this, because when Lois brings it up, he thinks it's stupid, and then she proves to him it's not. um but yeah, that is interesting to me, because he's basically pilot, Clark here, where we see, Clark and the pilot stop the bus from hitting the nuns and that type of, like he's doing these things sparingly, as he said, and as quickly and covertly as he can without wearing the cape.
For sure. So again, I don't want to, rush through anything, but we're almost at an hour and a half. So
yeah.
But is there anything else about these first? I mean, we can always circle back at the
No,
end.
I think these first two are probably the best of what they do with Tempus. But again, it is kind of infuriating to me where this show picks and chooses where it wants to have continuity. A, the time travel stuff never ever makes sense, and B, the idea that like at the end of this episode here, Tempus is being taken away by police for what? Like to what end? And then we find him, this version of him, ultimately forever from now, next season in an insane asylum. And like what do people think his crimes are? Where did he come from? How did he get out of old West Times Smallville, where we left him in the last episode? Like all those plot holes are just kind of left there, but that is also, again, the craziness of the show that we're watching.
No, okay, that's a great point. And so, right at the end of Tempus Fugitive, we find out that H.G. Wells dropped him at this insane asylum in 1866.
1866, yeah.
Right. And then in this Tempus Anyone bit, the older H.G. Wells explained that he got out and built another machine. So I was like, okay, we got an explanation. How? It's like how, and of course we don't see any of it. Also, I know we didn't mention this explicitly, but I think people probably could gather this, but after that first time travel episode, H.G. Wells returned Lois and Clark to the present before he had taken them, and that's why they don't remember. Of course, that makes no sense.
Right, absolutely no sense at all. I wish he had a neuralizer. I wish that Men in Black had come out already, and the writers would have thought of that. Yeah.
Yeah, that would have. Yeah, I mean, again, not to nitpick, but I was just like, man, this does not make any sense. But
yeah,
but to your point, that actually really did bother me. So in the Tempus Anyone episode, it's established that Tempus keeps coming back to our world to commit bank robberies. That's how he's funding everything he's doing in the alt universe.
Excellent.
And so at the end of this, they bring him back to our world, and that's what he's arrested for. And I just remember just last night as I was watching, I'm like, why? There's nothing else you can do with this guy. Like, it's crazy to me that you like bring him back
as a bank robber. Like, this guy's beyond that. He robbed a bank in the first one, but just to get gold to power the time machine, which we've all had to do at some point.
That's what you do.
Yes.
That's what you do with the little side. I love that.
That's such a pleasure. You understand. Yeah.
I got to say, though, just the like childhood memories. When I saw them pour in that first episode when they were dumping the gold into that little pocket of the
pouch on the time machine.
Pouch of the time machine. I was like, oh, I remember that. It just took me right back. Good stuff.
There's like an old like laundry like wringer or whatever they call it, like where you'd kind of like crank through to press out the water in it, and that's all that's in front of the time machine just to give them like that steampunkiness. Like, again, I love the homemade quality of everything on this show, from his suit to something like that.
Yeah, I have to tell you, in rewatching these, that stuff never really bothers me. Or even when the most we get when he's taking off is, he pulls the cape up, towards the camera. And
Cape's out. Yeah.
That doesn't bother me. I understand the constraints that they were under. That's fine. Like, I'm cool with that. We've look, especially at this point, my God, I mean, what they're able to achieve on Superman and Lois in terms of the visual effects and the spectacle of it, what we've seen in the movies, we've seen this stuff. So I'm more concerned about the relationships and those dynamics. So that stuff never really bothered
playing
me.
Pretend of it, again, like I said earlier, with like when they chose to do their Superman stuff, the playing pretend of it that they have to do on a weekly basis, it's just comfort food to me. Like, it's fun. It's the same way that like when you watch Batman 66 and every villain has the same like death machine box, and it's just like recolored to their motif that week. I'm like, great, it's fine. Like, oh no, they have a death machine box too. Like, what are we gonna do this week?
All right, so we're entering season 4 now, and we still have 3 more Tempus appearances. The first one is Soulmates, which comes right after.
Yeah, let's just speed right through this one, to be honest.
I'll be honest, I don't have a ton to say about this one. If anything, I more have a question for you. So the setup for this is poor Lois and Clark, after everything they've been through, it's their wedding night, and all they want to do is finally consummate their relationship. Which, side note, it's amazing to me that this didn't happen for these characters until, again, early in the fourth season.
Well, let's talk about that real quick on your side note. They get hot and heavy in a few episodes in season 3 when they're either engaged or not talking about engagement and dating and that type of thing. But then it's established in like season or episode 9 or something of season 3 that he is a virgin.
Yep.
And from then on, it is a chaste relationship where like earlier on, you're like, excuse me, you're at least doing some hand stuff. So like that's the only reason they decided to draw a line in the sand for whatever stupid Sunday night family show reason they decided to make him a virgin and make this a sexless relationship until then. And this was just kind of the last way that they could screw with them until they allowed them to go there.
Yeah, no, I definitely remember that when he reveals that he hasn't been with anyone, and yes, I what you're saying definitely lines up with my memory of this. But what's interesting is watching this the way I did last night, kind of in a vacuum. It didn't really bug me so much, but I feel like watching this after all of the wedding shenanigans.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, especially having just done this rewatch, how did it feel to hit this episode when it took so long to get them married, and now it's like these two can't even bang until they get through this whole reincarnation adventure.
Do this mess. This is kind of, it's not a good episode, but just the setup for it is the kind of thing where I love the show, where it's just like you're about to have sex, and then your buddy H.G. Wells shows up and is like, "Please don't have sex. You're going to end the world." Or, like you're going to start a curse. And it's like, oh, it's good to see you too. Like what? That is just kind of the magic of this type of series for me. Again, it's a reason I have a Legends of Tomorrow podcast where I'm just like, give me the most ridiculous setup you possibly can, and then try to pay it off with character and whatever you do with it after.
No, I hear you. I will say that, and again, I think this is a testament to Dean Cain and Terry Hatcher, that their frustration, like their characters' frustration, here's the thing. I really do like this, and I've talked about this in other episodes where, I think there's sometimes this argument against having Lois and Clark be married, like, oh, it removes the tension, this and that. But it's like, no, like these two, like they're hot for each other, right? And it's great.
Yes, that, like, I always think of Erica Durant's in the 100th or 200th episode, excuse me, of Smallville Homecoming, where they cut to the future and basically they're in the middle of an episode of Lois and Clark, and she is so horny for him. It's not even funny, but it's just awesome. Like in a very, like, they are married and in love. I think it's lame to say that getting them married brings away the tension. As married men, there can still be tension and it can still be interesting. Like that doesn't get rid of anything. If anything, it brings the stakes up higher. So that's just lazy to me. And here is kind of a dumb version of it. Like the problem with this episode for me is not so much the relationship stuff. I like their reaction to H.G. Wells, where when things are going badly and H.G. Wells shows up, it's like, oh, thank God. When things are going fine and H.G. Wells shows up, it's like, oh, God damn. Like what is about to happen? And that's totally what it is here, and it's really fun. This episode breaks the rules of what they kind of set up with Tempest and H.G. Wells already, where it gets away from the lore of them. It gets away from the time travel and the sci-fi of it, and it brings it more into fantasy and soulmates and reincarnation and that type of thing. I'm not saying you can't tell that type of story with Superman. I'm saying with these characters, it feels really, really out of place.
Agreed. Totally agreed, right? Because that's the setup here. H.G. Wells is like, no, you're soulmates. He's, they try to ground it in some sort of science where he's like, I've created a device that tracks soul energy. It's like, all right, and so Lois and Clark's souls are always intertwined. They're soulmates, but there was this curse that was placed on them in a prior life. It's very Hawkman, Hawkgirl-esque.
Yes, which I love. There,
yes. No,
but it
I'm with
kind of
you.
takes the magic of what they are away from that for me too. Just the idea that they've always been intertwined like this. Like, no, they're kind of one in a million for me.
I agree. And so, we end up in this episode, they sort of travel back and inhabit their past selves in medieval times and then in the Old West. And again, like I said, I don't have a ton to say, but the question I wanted to ask you, and I guess maybe you already answered, we talk about the whole fantasy aspect, but I looked at it more from the religious or at least spiritual perspective. And the reason why I wanted to ask you is because the episode prior where they finally get married,
Oh
right?
God, you're
They're
about to say the word Mike, aren't you?
you know what's so funny? I was gonna say Sam, but Mike. Uh, they're married by who seems to be a guardian angel, right? They're
Hmm.
never given an explanation of that, and then to go
Super
right
normal
from that,
stuff. Yeah, exactly.
into this. Actually, I have two questions, and then we'll get into the final two-parter, and I'll let you go and
Okay.
get on with your night here. But these episodes,
No,
our
no,
episodes
this
here
is a
tend to.
pleasure.
All right, good. I'm having so much fun. It's great to be able to talk about all of this. But I guess the first thing, and I'm sure I said this when we did our frog eating clone episode, but it always was so curious to me that they didn't use H.G. Wells to marry them.
Oh, that would have been. I never occurred to me, but that would have been wonderful.
Like he takes them to, not that they would call it the vanishing point, but like I take you to a moment outside of time, right? Like where this is a moment outside of time,
Yes.
and it's like it's grounded in what's already been established in the show's canon. And especially if they were planning to use him in the next episode, I feel like that would have worked nicely. But
Yeah.
at
Oh, that
least
would
there
have
would
been
have
lovely.
been right, and then at least he's a character we have a connection to, as opposed to Mike, where it's like, oh, he's been here all along, but we've never seen him.
Yeah. I look. I've got nothing informative to say about Mike, the guardian angel. Besides, I hate him. And I think it was a stupid idea. Except, I think it was just informed by Touched by an Angel at the time, and that's the closest I've ever gotten to kind of understanding what it was. But yeah, no, that would have been great. Literally anything else would have been wonderful besides Mike. You know Mike, our good buddy Mike. That's the thing that infuriates me in that episode where everybody suddenly has a connection to Mike and it's just like, wait, is he their guardian angel or is he God? Like, what is this?
So, uh, as a related note, when I watched the series finale as a kid, it was years
Mm.
later, I think, until I actually learned that they were planning on future seasons, right? That wasn't their intended end. Because I think when I
Because it's
watched
kind of not a bad last image for this show to go out on is them having a child. Yeah.
exactly. And I remember as a kid, my speculation was always, well, Mike or God or whatever just gave them a kid. And I felt like it tracked with what we had
Sure.
seen. This angel or God showed up and married them, and then at the end of the show, gave him a baby. And then years later, I'm really, learning. Oh, they had this plan to make it like a Kryptonian prince who was sent to them,
Kryptonian refugee prince. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
who ages rapidly. I'm like, wait, what? It's not Jesus? Like, what's going on here? So, but anyway, I guess the question that I had going from Mike to this whole idea of soulmates again, I feel like it's looking at the two of them together, like really delving into again the spiritual,
Mhm.
perhaps. I don't know. Just what is your take on that? Do you feel like that was? I mean, I guess maybe I know
I
the answer. But
Yeah, you can tell by my attitude. I'm not a religious person, but just taking that out of this the or spiritual person, to be clear. I just don't think I think there's a good way to tell that story. I don't think this was it. I don't think this is the right set of characters to use for that type of idea. Um, it's just kind of a story excuse to do Maid Marian and whatnot. Um, I I might be half remembering this. I believe initially this was supposed to be Lex, which is a little more interesting to me. But if nothing else, the fact that this is Tempest speaks to kind of my ongoing theory that, like, at a certain point here, Tempest became the main antagonist for this series. And there's never like a quote unquote big bad, like we would define it now for this show, really past season one where Lex was. But if ever there was one, it's Tempest. And this kind of speaks to that. But again, at the same time, it's a dumb way to execute this type of story. if for no other reason, it's completely out of left field, and it betrays the type of story dynamic we've already set up with these two specific characters, Tempest and H.G. Wells.
Totally. Absolutely. I mean, I definitely felt the same way watching it. And also, all of a sudden, this whole idea of Tempest in past lives being in love with Lois, it's just like, so to your point, though, I mean, I guess if this were meant to be Lex, that would make a ton more sense.
Right, exactly. But like Tempest has no romantic interest in Lois. He just wants to see her suffer.
Exactly.
Our Tempest, my Tempest. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. I do agree with you, though. I feel like if you really are looking at the arc of the series, I think Tempest does get the top spot as the villain of the show. I think that's very fair to say.
And again, it's because of the time travel nature and the knowledge that he knows, being from the future, his plots get to be the big epic ones. If there were big, kind of like story long arcs in the show, they would probably be his for the most part. And that kind of gets you that top villain status.
Real quick, one thing that I actually really, though I did like, this made me laugh in the episode when they're in the Old West and Clark is the lone rider and then he's a telegraph operator. And he rescues Lois and he changes into his telegraph operator garb. And then, old time Tempest shows up. He's like, oh, how odd that you're out here, miles away from the nearest telegraph. And then he looks at H.G. Wells and he's like, I don't even want to know who he is.
I get there's good parts in every episode of Lois and Clark, but there's also really stupid parts in it too. And there's the stupid outweighs the good in this particular episode, and it's my least favorite Tempest. Do I understand ratings wise why the minute you have them married, you want to bring back the fan favorite villain in order to keep people watching? Absolutely. And if tracking the ratings like I did on my podcast, you can see why that would have been a concern at the time. Let's say that.
You know what this reminded me of? Because I did watch back in the day Xena and Hercules, and they would do those periodic episodes where they're like, reincarnated selves would be in the present day and stuff like that. That's kind of what it reminded me of.
That's interesting. See, I have very little understanding of Xena and Hercules. Like I saw a couple episodes of Xena as a kid. I don't think I've ever seen Hercules, but that's fun. That's cool. And yes, I totally get why there is that kind of comparison here.
All right. So our last two-parter here. Now, when I say the name John Doe, what does that conjure within you?
God, he's just a darn nice guy to me.
Darn nice guy. Warm, fuzzy feelings whenever I hear
warm, fuzzy.
Yeah. Papa's home or whatever it was. Yeah, very presidential. Papa?
We're the kitties, or whatever he makes them say. This arc, I said this a lot on my podcast. When this show is funny, it's hilarious. When it thinks it's funny, it's terrible. This is a moment where the show is funny, and it's great. This first episode in particular of this 2-episode arc is written by Tim Minear, he was Firefly's showrunner. He wrote on Angel. He was, basically in Whedon camp, and now he's in Ryan Murphy world. And a friend of my podcast got to interview him for that. But just an incredible TV writer and a very funny and dry dude, and that comes out very clearly in this script and makes it really an enjoyable watch every time.
Yeah, this was really a fun two-parter. I agree. The first part more, I did, and it might have just been that it was getting late, and I watched 5 episodes in a row last night.
Yeah,
but by the 5th one, I was a little bit like, all right, like we gotta wrap this up now. But the first part was definitely strong, and I really do remember that. So of course our setup here is that Tempest, he's in the insane asylum in present day Metropolis, and one of the peacekeepers from the future shows up to bring him back, and they create this replicant to take his place to not arouse suspicion. But then, of course, he gets the drop.
All normal things, what you just said. Yes.
Yep. Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
It all tracks. And so then he creates, and then he travels through time, right? He goes to the far future and he gets this, basically this hypnosis technology, right?
Hypnotic ray of some kind. Yeah.
That he's able to beam these subliminal messages through the phone system, across the country. And so it implants this suggestion that John Doe is a darn nice guy. And so he emerges as this last minute write in presidential candidate going up against
It's
Fred
right in.
Willard's.
Right.
Yeah, write in.
Yeah, Fred Willard's President Gardner, who has already proven himself to be a very stupid man in previous episodes.
Yes. What I loved about this was, as I've said, I'm a big fan of the Triangle era comics and the sort of
Mhm.
the period within that other than the death of Superman, that really holds a very special place for me. The early 2000s, Jeff Loeb and Joe Kelly were the main writers on the Superman books, and this was President Lex territory.
Yeah.
And so to see a
There's
version of
that.
that where there's a bad guy who Clark knows is a villain, who everyone is rallying around, and yes, there's this whole added component of the mind control, but still this whole sense. And there's that one point where Lois says to him, like, basically go kick his ass, and he's like,
Mhm.
like Superman
He's the
can't do
president.
that. He's the
Yeah.
yeah. And it really called to mind, I think, some of the best themes and beats of the President Lex arc, just his frustration of having to trust in the system, but knowing that it's not working.
I never really thought about that. That was literally when I was subscribed to Superman comics as a kid based on this show and based on Batman Loves. And I had Superman and Batman delivered to my house on a monthly basis because there was no comic book store anywhere close that my mother would drive me to. But yeah, like that was that era for me. I'd never thought about that, but you're absolutely right where this is a little bit of a precursor to that kind of idea, and gets to play up the same elements. That's really cool. I'd never thought of that.
And of course, there's the scene where Lois and Clark are watching the news footage, and
Oh
John
boy,
Doe, have to address it, talks about
let's
making
do
this
it.
country great again. And I was like, God damn it.
I asked Tim Minear about this, where I'm like, did did you have any kind of recognition when our own idiot president started doing that, or presidential candidate at the time? And he's like, like there's no thought to that. Like I was writing for Reagan, basically. Like people have been saying this for years as if it means anything. And I'm like, yeah, that's true. But it's a telling little piece of fiction at the time where a scripted Dean Cain is reacting to that like it's horrible, and then unfortunately he doesn't in real life many years later. But yeah, that and early in the Nazi episode too, there's another moment where someone was like, "This guy's trying to make America great again." It's like, oh Jesus Christ! Like it was always kind of there.
Yeah, I do say, I have to say though, the whole John Doe is a darn nice guy. It and maybe to your point about the show, actually being fun, like it was funny, and it was funny when people would repeat it, but there was also again this undercurrent of danger, and of course Lois and Clark realized
Yes.
what's going on, and it was again the stakes felt very real. Again, I feel like this was another good balance where this could have been very silly,
Hmm.
but you felt the stakes at the same
And
time.
it keeps the fun of it 100%. Like this is a really good version of using mostly Tempest until I think it's not until the second part after Superman's been disappeared that we actually get H.G. Wells.
Yes.
But it's a really good use of these characters. Um, and like you're saying, like Tempest is written, I think, very humorously, has some of his best lines in the whole series in these two episodes. But the thread of it is real, kind of like the idea of the Lex presidency thing, to the point where he does the best job anyone's ever going to do of getting rid of Superman on this show in this arc, where you kind of Phantom Zone is fair, but he traps him in like a moment between time, and he's getting smaller and smaller, and if you're gonna get him, you're gonna have to get to the nanosecond of when he was disappeared, and be on the time machine, and blah blah blah. Like, it's all ridiculous, but it's also pretty foolproof as a villain that he's able to accomplish this. What falls apart for me in this episode is his plan later on, where he's just gonna like seemingly nuke the world, or like start nuking people as he's become president, and he's like literally playing paddleball as the nuclear football is being armed. And it's like, well, to at this point, to what end, dude? Like there's no kind of other end game for you here besides just wanting death and destruction. Like that's just kind of a betrayal to me, but otherwise it's fun, and he does a good job of being a villain who wants to get rid of Superman.
Yeah, I mean, I guess by the time we're at that point in part 2, the alt Superman, right, has been able to dismantle that the hypnotic device, right? So
Yes.
he knows his control over the people is coming to an
It's
end,
gonna fade, yeah.
but it's like it escalates quickly, right? from
Yes.
from that to, well, I'm gonna
It's
blow
a
up the
it's
world.
a smidge rushed by the end, but yeah.
But
But that's also like we're talking about a lot that we liked episode 1 of this two-parter, and I think Tempest is certainly strongest in episode 1 of this two-parter. The second part of it really plays into that alt Superman stuff, the Earth 2 Superman stuff like we were talking about earlier, and he meets the Kents and he and Lois almost kiss or whatever, and that's all really interesting. And just the fact that this show, a season later, the show of, again, questionable continuity, checked back in with that alternate version of Superman, and it's implied by the end of it that like H.G. Wells is going to go help him find his Lois and save her in that world is interesting to me. I like that he gets a happy ending. I like that they acknowledge like just because our Clark is gone doesn't mean we're completely out of Clarks. Like we can go get this guy, and we've established this before. That's interesting.
I'm with you, and especially watching them all in a row the way I did. I mean, this was an instance where it really tracked, it held up, and you watch those episodes together, and it's like, okay, yeah, this is the version of the Earth 2 Clark now more evolved, right? He's further into his career as a superhero. That's clear, and there's some great stuff. We already talked about when he meets the Kens, but when he and Lois are on the street and they're strategizing about what they're going to do, and that moment where he's like, oh, is this what it's like
This
when
one's
you guys
like
are working together? It's like, it's nice. There's so much, it definitely tugs at the heartstrings. He has a lot of moments like that. That's the thing. It still, definitely feels like the Clark we know, but definitely with this air of sadness and tragedy with what he's lost.
A little more sadness, a little more like innocence in a certain way where he hasn't quite, kind of gone through all the trials he has. He's also a very different Clark, which they don't explore much in this episode, but like he's a Clark from a world where there is no secret identity at all. People know that Clark Kent is Superman. And that's, I wish, if anything, I wish they kind of explored that a little bit more, but they had enough story to deal with here.
I agree. That was one thing where I thought we maybe get like a line or two, just like, is he still a reporter? How did that play out? That would have been nice to know. That really would have been
Probably
nice.
not, but
Probably not. Well, if you read the Brian Bendis comics, he's still, when he reveals his identity, he's still a reporter. They just fortify the Daily Planet. It's ridiculous. Anyway, I've complained about that already.
And over. So congratulations. And
I feel very vindicated, I got to tell you.
Yeah.
But anyway, and just little things like, Lois gets all these, all the snack food, like, Twinkies and ding dongs that she knows Clark likes. And he's like, oh, like that's not his thing. And, when he goes to change in the closet, right? Instead of doing
cute.
the spin move, and she calls that
the
out.
Tasmanian
and then he tries it
Devil
later.
move,
Yeah. Which, and I'm sure you've talked about this. It makes no sense to me, though. I don't, like, especially in that instance where he clearly is not wearing anything. He's wearing a short sleeve shirt. Where's the costume?
Oh God, does he have a short sleeve shirt on? That's funny. The thing that always bothers me with just, and again, not to be a Tempest here, but the thing that's always really stupid to me is like, all right, he's wearing the suit underneath. Where are the boots? He's just got boots under his socks in his loafers. Like, that's stupid.
Yeah, that's really that's pushing.
But it's fine. I don't care.
But it was cool. And then, of course, it's the watch that had stopped at the moment of the explosion. And then they're able to use that to pinpoint the exact second to find him.
Good thing that clock was on time. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's true. Oh, and then, just real quick in part 1, I do have to say, in the midst of all the Tempest shenanigans and everything, there's still this core of, Clark's having these nightmares about being ripped apart from Lois. And in the nightmare, she's pulled into that time window. And then, of course, when it plays out in reality, he's the one who goes. But, that's really informing a lot of, how he's proceeding through that episode. And it's really this fear, which I thought was, especially now that they're a married couple and, Lois is talking about making her will. And I think just in terms of relatability, the humanity, these are, this felt very real.
Again, it's a show for kids and whatever other audience want to put onto it. Like, I understand that, but exactly what you're talking about is kind of that fear of like, as someone desperately in love with someone a few rooms over who's probably not listening. I don't worry about dying early. I worry about her dying early. I worry about losing her and excuse me, what that world will be like. And that's exactly the fear that they're playing into this in that moment. And it's really true to me. Like, it's really kind of beautiful and nice that they tapped into that. And like, he's not having premonitions or anything. He's just stressed out, and he's envisioning this kind of instance where she's taken from him in any way, and that's the worst thing that could possibly happen to him.
Yeah, no, listen, I identify with that with respect to my wife and our son. I talk about this a lot on the show, but it's like, as long as they're okay, like, I'm whatever, like, I'm
Right.
good. Either whatever, like, as long as they're okay, that's the thing. And then, in the next episode, Lois has this great exchange with Alt Clark where she's talking about how, when you're married to someone, you just kind of take for granted that they're always going to
Oh
be there.
God, I
And it's like,
love that speech. Yes.
the way they, lie next to you on the bed and the sound they make while they sleep. And no joke, last night when I got into bed and my wife was long asleep because I was, again, watching 5 episodes last night, and I got in bed and it's like, and I'm, in all seriousness, like, for a few seconds, like, I just looked over, like, I listened to her, she was breathing, and I was like, yeah, like, there's really something to that. So it tapped
Hmm.
into something that I think we can all relate to. It was good stuff.
Yep. No, I completely agree. That's the stuff in this episode that works really well. And then Tempest has a few good one-liners, and unfortunately, that's kind of how we see Tempest end in this show. He gets, at the end of the episode, they do save Clark from the Phantom Zone, for lack of a better word. Um, they get rid of Earth 2 Clark, but not before they have him show up and dissuade the public of President Tempest's whole idea that Clark Kent is Superman, because we've got two of them there at the same time. And Tempest is carted away yelling "duh," his catchphrase, at the audience. And that's what we got. That's the end of Tempest for us. That said, he 100% would have been back in season 5. He, like, again, if this show was a little bit later in the development of TV, and by that I kind of mean post Joss Whedon, like, he would have been a series long bad at some point. Like, he was pivotal to this version of the story and what they were doing. And just by virtue of cancellation, this is just kind of the anticlimactic end of him.
Agreed. No, for sure. I think they're definitely, yeah. Again, we're at the point where we're getting at least one appearance. I mean, well, that's the
Hmm.
interesting thing too. Season 4, we get 3 appearances, so it's
Three
like,
appearances.
where we, would we've gotten even more in a potential fifth season? Maybe not. You know what though? To your point, when we get to the to the stage here where he wants to nuke the world, maybe there are only so many more places to go.
Maybe we've played out a lot of what Tempest is, yeah, but who knows? He 100% would have come back. There was rumor at the time. I Here's the thing. It was early internet when the show ended in 1997. I don't know how much I actually put stock in any of what the rumors were, but there was talk of a Lex Tempest team up, which makes sense to me, which would have been so fun to see those two actors try to outperform each other in a scene. Like, I would have been 100% there for it. But unfortunately, we just kind of never got there. The thing that bugs me, and I'm sure it's all rights and whatever, and maybe even ties back to the Jimmy Olsen issue 98, which I wrote down to try to find after we hang up here. Um, I wish that this character had made it into, had made the Harley Quinn jump, had made it into comics. And obviously, it wouldn't have all been the same tone or whatever, but I think it's an interesting character, even if you take away certain elements of Utopia, and he's just like, maybe he's a Legion of Superheroes villain who decides, like, I'm going to cut, you know, this thing off at the source and stop Superman. That would work for me. Whatever version of it. I just think he's an interesting added spoke to the wheel that the show introduced that multimedia hasn't really exploited yet.
That was actually going to be my parting question, and you beat me to it, and I
Sorry.
agree. No. That's the thing. We're on the same page. I'm with you, and I feel the exact same way. It's like as I'm watching these episodes, I'm like, man, it's kind of crazy that you didn't see this character made the jump. And like you said, maybe there's an underlying reason for it, but yeah, it feels like there's a missed opportunity here, and
Right.
you definitely livened up the proceedings on the show. And for anyone who hasn't watched in a while, maybe skip Soulmates, but otherwise the other 4 episodes we talked about, I would really say give them a watch. They're a lot of fun.
They're really good. And again, not like you were saying, not typical episodes of the show, but a good pulse check on what the show is capable of throughout the run of it. My question for you, talking about rights and like why he hasn't made the jump, makes me think of oh my God, King Tut and Maxie Zeus, where they're kind of the same character, but the aesthetics are changed in order to get by copyright, essentially. Is there a character in the comics where you can point to that has some of this same idea, like a villain from the future type idea in modern comics, or is this just still kind of an untapped concept?
I mean, like, there are definitely time traveling villains. Of course, as I'm saying this, I'm like blanking on.
Sorry, we're late to. We're late on the West Coast. We're very late on the East Coast. I'm sorry.
No. It's again, the thought had crossed my mind. I guess definitely there are time traveling villains, but and audience, listen, open the floor to you. Reach out. I guess I'm hard pressed to think of someone who I would really say is like, this is a pretty close analog to this character. Like, I don't really see that. Certainly in terms of that characterization, and at the same time, I don't know. I think so much of this was wrapped up, of course, in that performance. And so as much as it's like, oh, we would love to see the character, I don't know, but I think it's worth a shot.
Yeah, 100%. Speaking of the performance, we haven't talked about kind of the biggest rumor that's out there that comes from a Lane Davies interview recently. Do you know who Lane Davies says they initially wanted to cast in this role?
All right, I was going to let this go because we just passed 2 hours, but you brought it up and it's worth mentioning. I actually came across this because I was just searching on Twitter last night. I was like, oh, what?
Yeah.
Like, among people I follow, like what's been said about Tempest, and our mutual friends, the All-Star Superfan podcast, I believe they had a tweet that originally this was offered or intended for Christopher Reeve. Has that been so you said that comes from a Lane Davies?
What is the name of that podcast? I'm so sorry. Comic Book Central, I think. Where they had him. Apparently he responded to their emails. But he said like he came in kind of late in the casting process because it was going to go to Christopher Reeve, and he wasn't able to do it. I forget would this have lined up with the accident? I don't know. When was his accident? But maybe not. For whatever reason, Christopher Reeve couldn't do it, and Lane Davies got the tap. But I think Christopher Reeve is a fantastic actor, capable of many things. It's just it's hard for me to picture him in this type of role. It's also weird to me that like you're gonna get Christopher Reeve on your Superman show and you're gonna burn him as this villain specifically, like not someone from the comics, not a Jor-El, not something in that vein. It's weird to me. Smallville, in fairness, uses him as an original character, but to great effect, I think, where this is a very different tone.
Totally. So his accident was May 95. So the first episode of this, I think, aired in 95,
No,
but earlier.
they would, yeah, sorry. It would have aired in 95 in like March, I think. So they would have shot it in like January. So it doesn't quite add up, but interesting.
But I did come across that really is kind of mind boggling, but
yeah.
Kind of.
Again, I don't know how much I trust stuff like this from back in the day, even though it's coming from Lane Davies. Who knows what he was told on set? I really like I'm just caveating because I don't know, but it's an interesting idea, if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's one of these things where maybe there was a thought of having him, right? Maybe someone had the idea. Maybe they even made it. There was some sort of outreach, but as far as whether, how real it actually was or how likely, I don't know. But,
Yeah.
I can't thank you enough for your time. I mean, people might be surprised because I think we bounced off each other very nice. This is the first time you and I've ever spoken.
This was an absolute pleasure, dude.
No, it really
Thank you
was
so
a lot of
much.
fun.
I heard of your podcast, to be completely honest, the first time when you had Zach on. And I'm not as big a student of the comics as perhaps I should be, but I've loved your show and what you've heard. And just having listened to it, I knew that this would be a nice conversation. You have a perfect radio voice. And I hope I hope I did well for you. I was a little nervous coming on tonight, to be honest with you. I'm a fan, so this was a pleasure, dude. Thank you.
Listen, all right back at you, and this was fantastic. And I appreciate all of that, and I appreciate Zach. There've been a number of instances where I know some people have found me through him, others have found him through me. He has a number of guests, yourself included, have come my way through him. So I'm
He's
very grateful.
really, I mean, I am currently the host of one of his podcasts, Always Hold On to DC's Legends of Tomorrow. And I met my co-host on that because he was like, hey, I had this woman, Trisha, on my podcast, and she talked about a lot about Lois and Clark. You guys should hook up. And he put us in a chat, and that was kind of the end of it. And years later, we're co-hosting a podcast. So you never know. He's good at doing that kind of podcasting network thing.
Yeah, and not to make this all about Zach, but I will sing his praises for one moment.
Yeah,
more.
enough. He doesn't need it.
No, but in all fairness, it's like, his Always Hold On to Smallville is so successful, right? He's done so well with it and has a great audience, and he's reached a lot of people. And it would be, if he was just like, hey, I'm doing my own thing, like, and that's it.
Fine.
It would be understandable. Yeah. But he really makes these connections when he doesn't have to, and that's very nice and very appreciated. So, shout out to him. And I want to ask you about Always Hold On to Legends, but I just, the last thing before that is just, I know you spent, an entire podcast series, right, talking about this. But, I don't, it's rare for me to be able to talk, not to be able to, I mean, I could do more episodes on it, but, there's only so many spots for it. And so it's rare for me to have this opportunity to have an extended conversation about Lois and Clark. So this was like really a treat. I really, really enjoyed this. So thank you.
No, thank you. And again, it's the one that it and Superboy are the one that get ignored a lot. Which I say like it's my show. It's not my show, but I love it. It's what brought me into this. Sorry, I've got cats freaking out.
That's okay.
It's what brought me into this comic book world, and specifically the Superman character, and made me kind of fall in love with him like we do. So I just like seeing that it gets love, and it's on HBO Max. Everybody, if you have a fond memory of it, if any of what we just talked about, struck your fancy, if you're listening to this podcast, you have an HBO Max subscription, so check some out. It's in beautiful HD right now. Enjoy it while it lasts.
Yeah, I know. Probably won't be there for long, but I know they do look great. But yeah. So Lois and Clark, the new podcast of Superman. Obviously, you concluded your rewatch. All those episodes are out there on all major podcast.
All those episodes,
platforms,
including a abridged kind of read through that we did for charity towards the end of the series. The episode's called Tempus and Herb, but it's a read through of the script of Tempus Fugitive with all the friends and Zach Moore included playing Clark. So definitely check that out.
And then, like we've been saying, you are now currently hosting Always Hold On to DC's Legends of Tomorrow. So in the grand tradition of Always Hold On to Smallville, Always Hold On to Arrow, and so on, we now have this. And you guys, so you and Trisha, so the approach is you roll the dice, right? As far as what you do, so yes. You don't go chronologically.
We're taking it as seriously as the Legends would take it. Themselves. Anybody that watched that show, it's a time travel show that just jumps all over the place. So after we did the pilot, we started rolling a D8 and a D20 for all you D&D nerds out there. And literally at the end of every episode, the fates tell us what our next episode will be. And it's been really, really fun so far, because watching that show in order would be fun, but it really doesn't get going until season 3. Like, let's be completely honest. So just a conceit for a podcast like that, where we get to talk to the initiated about the show as a whole throughout it. Even when we're in a season 1 episode, we can reference season 7 or whatever. Like, that's been really fun.
I love that. I think it's such a cool approach, and I agree with you. I'll be honest, I did not make it all the way to the end of the show. I tapped out right after Crisis, but I agree that that's how the legends themselves would probably approach it. So I think
yeah, exactly. Totally worth your time. If nothing else, at least listen to our season 5, 6, and 7 coverage.
Yes. Yes. If nothing, at some point, maybe I'll go back. I'll see. But, and that's available on all major podcast platforms as well. Correct?
Yes. Yeah. Anywhere we're finding this, or at least always holding a Smallville, we're at.
All right. Awesome. Well, Matt, thank you again. This really was an absolute blast, and it was great meeting you.
Great meeting you. I hope we get to do this again sometime.
I think that's a safe bet. So, so thank you, Matt. Thank you, audience. As always, I really appreciate it. I hope you are enjoying our Electric till 1 million event. It's been a blast so far. We have a lot more to come. Make sure you come back next week. And as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all.